Hi, everybody. Welcome to Addressing Chronic Absenteeism, How Data Interoperability Enables School Districts to Capture Student Attendance. While you're coming in, please introduce yourself in the chat. It'd be great if you could tell us your name, what you do, and where you are right now. And then if you'd like, we'd also love to hear as a little poll over this past year, if your school district was mostly in person, mostly remote, or a mix of the two. And we'll be getting started in just a couple minutes. Hi, everybody. For those who are coming in now, we're just introducing ourselves in the chat. Please tell us your name, what you do, and where you are right now. And if you'd like, we're also taking a poll of over this past year, if you were mostly virtual, mostly in person, or a mix of the two. And hello to everybody who's coming in and introducing themselves. Thank you for chatting in. We're going to get started. Welcome to Addressing Chronic Absenteeism, How Data Interoperability Enables Districts to Capture Student Attendance. We're thrilled to have you with us, and we have a great panel here today to speak with you. For today's session, we're excited to be working with AttendanceWorks, the EdFi Alliance, and Education Analytics for this conversation. My name is Elise Hawthorne, and I'm Technical Support and Implementation Lead with Project Unicorn, which is an initiative of Innovate EDU. Our speakers today are Hetty Chang of AttendanceWorks, Maureen Wentworth of the EdFi Alliance, and Noah Bookman of Education Analytics. And for today's agenda, we are going to start with an introduction to data interoperability and updates from Project Unicorn. Then Hetty will be walking us through the concept of chronic absenteeism, explaining what chronic absenteeism is, sharing some of the data to help illustrate what its stakes are. Then Maureen will describe some of the tools that are available for addressing chronic absenteeism in schools and school systems. And Noah will cover some really interesting work illustrating the power of interoperability and attendance data in practice. We'll then wrap up today's session with a Q&A. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat, get involved, and start conversations. And we will address those questions in the Q&A portion of the event. And I wanted to start off by sharing a little more information about Project Unicorn. Project Unicorn is dedicated to promoting and implementing data interoperability in the K-12 space by providing support and resources for school systems and ed tech vendors. And one of the things that's unique about our organization is that we have a technical advisory committee, our TAC, which is comprised of partners ranging from data standards bodies to ed tech companies working in curriculum and integration. And today's session is a part of our TAC webinar series, and the committee helped us to identify needs and brainstorm ideas for this session. So with this shift to remote education in the pandemic, we've really seen more and more school systems realizing the importance of data interoperability. And interoperability is the seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between applications. With school systems using more tech tools than ever, this can mean anything from teachers not having to enter the same scores into a bunch of different apps to being able to create dashboards that can pull important insights from multiple systems and tools and help make better informed decisions. So here we have a graphic illustrating some of the ways that data interoperability can really help systems function more effectively. And one very crucial application of interoperability over this past year has been attendance, and especially thinking about chronic absenteeism. So we're really lucky to have a group here today who can help us understand chronic absenteeism and how interoperability can help address it, share lessons learned, and start thinking about how we can apply these lessons in the coming school year. I'd also like to just share a reminder, if you haven't signed our Project Unicorn pledge yet, we would love to have you sign the pledge and join us as one of our district partners. And we'll also share a little more information about this at the end of the session today. So we're very proud to be able to present the webinar today, and I'm pleased to turn things over to Hetty Chang, Director of Attendance Works, to explain chronic absenteeism and talk about the importance of attendance data.
Great, thanks so much. Such a pleasure to be here. Just checking, Elise, you can hear me, yes? Perfect. So I wanted to have a chance to talk, just do a little bit of level setting, and then also talk a bit about some of the implications of monitoring chronic absence during this crazy time of COVID-19 and the switch back and forth between different modes of learning. So next slide, please. So let me start by just making sure we all have a common understanding of what we mean by chronic absence, which is actually only been around about 10 years as a metric. Chronic absence is missing too much school for any reason, whether that's excused, unexcused, or suspensions. That counts as chronic absence, and we look at it as missing 10% or more of the year because we want it to serve as an early warning sign. So 2 days in the first month, 4 days in the second month, 6 days in the third month, that allows you to notice chronic absence and take action before kids miss so much school that they're going to fall academically behind. It's different from truancy, which is unexcused absences, or average daily attendance, which is how many kids typically show up each day. Both truancy and average attendance rates can actually mask high levels of chronic absence. Next slide. And we know that it matters, if you go to the next slide, thank you, because now there's a whole wealth of data that shows chronic absence is associated, starting in kindergarten and first grade, with actually being poor attendance in later grades, the inability to read on grade level by the end of third grade, lower academic performance, higher suspensions in middle school, and high school dropout. Next slide. So COVID-19 had a huge impact on our ability to track and monitor absenteeism, which before COVID-19, it was actually something that everyone took every day. We kind of all knew what it was. It was kids showing up, marking off, they're here. It was pretty consistently measured across states, districts, schools, and grades. We had pretty good auditing systems. It was kind of hard to manipulate. It was captured by most places all the time, and this is why it became such a measure that was adopted at such scale, 37 states using it for school accountability under the Every Student Succeeds Act. But once COVID hit, there were just huge ramifications for attendance. The last part of last spring, when COVID first hit, a lot of people stopped taking attendance at all. And even last year, only 31 states plus Washington, D.C. actually required that you needed to take attendance daily. What was attendance when you were in remote learning? Varied tremendously, often across states and within states. And another challenge, which is very connected to our conversation today, is that the data on attendance no longer was just sort of in your SIS system, your student information system, but it could be in your LMS system. It could be in your, if you're participating on Zoom. So now it raises all these issues of interoperability, because the question is, how do I take this data from all these different places and then make sure we can still have attendance data? And we also lacked a lot of research on what were remote early warning metrics. What are the best ways for noticing when kids are stopping to participate in distance learning so that we can take action? At the same time, I will say chronic absence is still required. States, in order to get their waivers on ESSA accountability, are being told you have to provide disaggregated data reports. So I actually am a little bit worried about what the quality of data this year is going to be, but what I know is that the only way you get better data quality is to look at the data that you have and then figure out how you're going to improve it over time. And if kids turned out chronically absent at this moment in time, I think it means we're sure they're in challenge. We just may be slightly underestimating the challenge. Next slide. We know, so Connecticut is one exception though. I actually think they have pretty high quality data. They defined attendance as being there half a day, similar in distance as it is in in-person learning, and similar to past ways, the way data was collected on attendance in the past. And they started collecting data monthly, reviewing it monthly, and then giving feedback to districts so that if there were noticeable challenges with the data, they could actually resubmit accurate data. What they are seeing, what they saw this last year, was they actually saw an increase in chronic absence, almost a doubling from 12 to 22%, 12 to 20%. And we saw this particularly for kids who had disabilities, who were living in poverty, and students who were homeless, already had high levels, but even higher levels. Next slide. Now, the other really interesting thing that Connecticut was able to do, which I think offers us some insights about what we all might want to do in the coming year, is they were able to look at chronic absence across learning modes. So they could look at and say, okay, that light blue line, that's chronic absence in distance learning. The green line below that, that's chronic absence for kids who were experiencing a mix of distance and in-person, so hybrid learning. The bottom lines, the line that is dark blue, the dark teal, that was this year's in-person chronic absence levels. The black gray line, that was chronic absence levels from the prior year. And what you can see is almost a doubling in levels of chronic absence, but a different pattern. Typically, you see a little bit of this U-shape a little bit, although Connecticut, which has been investing in attendance improvement for a while, has actually been working to really decrease chronic absence even in the early grades. Now you see high levels of chronic absence got a little bit better in the other grades, but still pretty elevated. You know, over 20% of their first, second, third, fourth graders were chronically absent. But then what's really troubling is you see this spike. Ninth grade shows really high levels of chronic absence. And that's very troubling given how we know that ninth grade chronic absence is a real predictor of high school dropout, and it can really cause kids to get off track for graduation. Next slide. And what they also could see from this is that the patterns were different for different ethnic groups. This, if you look at the Latino, which is the bottom far left, and the African American, the Black kids, students who are on the right side, you're seeing that those two groups are driving the increase in ninth grade chronic absence. And it means that for next year, as they're planning COVID relief activities, they're going to really have to think about, what am I going to do about the 10th graders? These kids aren't ninth grade anymore. They're going into 10th grade, but they lost out on all the opportunities to feel connected, supported. This was a really tough year. And we have these extremely high levels, particularly for African American, for Black and Hispanic or Latino young kids, high levels in the elementary grades. These have long-term consequences and have serious implications for how districts and how states invest their COVID relief dollars to make sure that the kids who lost out most during the pandemic have a chance and an opportunity to recover, succeed, and thrive. Next slide. We've also seen some other data that you might be interested in. This is from FutureEd, and they looked at 5 large districts that were in the west and southwest of the country. They found that not only are more kids missing school, but there are more kids missing a lot of school. And absenteeism rates, similar to what we saw in Connecticut, are rising faster among younger kids. Disadvantaged kids are seeing the biggest jumps. This is also in the younger grades corresponding particularly with enrollment declines. So this idea of missed school in general is really a challenge. And we're also seeing that there's this weird mirage of perfect attendance rates being up, which is more likely a reflection of the fact that in distance learning, we were less good at capturing attendance and absence. Next slide. What we know, and what you want to think about with this data, is when you see absenteeism, it's a sign that positive conditions for learning might be missing. Kids come to school when they feel physically, emotionally healthy and safe, when they feel a sense of belonging, connection, support, when they feel academic challenge and engagement, when they're surrounded by adults and peers who have the emotional competence to support this. And if they aren't coming to school, it's a real sign that one or more of these conditions might be in place, not be in place. And I think this is a model to think about as we return to in-person learning, largely in-person learning. We closed schools to allow kids to stay healthy and safe this last 18 months. We're going to reopen schools. For families to want to come back to school, they have to be assured of health and safety. And if they're not showing up, it could be a sign that that assurance isn't being felt or heard or understood, or they're not feeling the sense of belonging, connection, support. This is, for example, what I think about what's happened with the ninth graders. It is hard, that transition to ninth grade. You really, and high schools have known this for a long time. That's why they invest in ninth grade academies. They invest in ninth grade transition. And that did not happen for a whole cohort of ninth graders across the country, I think. Connecticut, which has long had a huge investment in addressing chronic absence and supporting this work so well, they're seeing almost a third of their ninth graders who are in distance learning having these challenges. I can only imagine this exists in other places in the country, but you're going to have to look at your own data to figure out to what extent it exists and do these patterns hold true. Next slide. We also see that if you have this data, it allows you to take a much more integrated, multi-tiered system of support. You look at how do you put in place foundational whole school supports, universal prevention, tier 2 and tier 3. And the notion of a multi-tiered system of support is that if you first have to invest in the universal prevention in tier 1, and if you have high levels of chronic absence, it is often an indication that the whole school and tier 1 supports aren't in place. And then if you do have them in place, you're using your data to add in more early intervention, more intensive intervention. Next slide. And I just want you to call attention to the fact that we did put, this is unusual for an MTSS, we added in this notion of foundational supports because we saw these as the things that schools typically do that promote attendance. They're not necessarily about attendance, but when they're in place, attendance is better. Having advisories, having enrichment, having access to tech equipment and connectivity. In that case, when attendance is virtual. Knowing where to show up to class, which was a little bit troubling this year. These are all fundamental building blocks. And when you see high levels of chronic absence, it could suggest one or more of these fundamental building blocks is not in place. And now that we have this sort of ability to go between in-person and hybrid learning and distance learning, we have to think about what are those foundational supports that make sure kids can show up under any mode of instruction, especially if we might still have to shift back and forth between in-person and distance learning, depending on what happens with COVID. Fingers crossed we're all in person, but I don't know that we can always guarantee that. Next slide. So this is really about putting a systemic approach to reducing chronic absence in place. That means you have to have actionable data that gets to have positive engagement. You use strategic partnerships because often when you uncover issues, it may not just be within the purview of schools to address those barriers. So you need to be able to share your data with other partners so they can also partner with schools to address those issues. You need to make sure you have adequate and equitable resources so the places that have the greatest challenges get more. We need shared accountability, so we see this as all of our problems and challenges, and we have to have capacity building to ensure that we can do this together. Next slide. So we have a few recommendations that I hope you'll think about. As data this year is going to be challenging, but we have to make sure next year we have better data, and we have to take the data that we have right now and use it for informing our work. But as we think about moving forward in the future, and right now is a key time for improving your data systems, because you'll want to have this in place before we reach the next school year. We need to make sure everyone returns to tracking attendance every day. We need to have a common definition of attendance across learning modes. We need to monitor attendance disaggregated by learning mode, grade, ethnicity, school, and invest in data systems that can produce the data that will allow us to monitor that. We have to invest in research on early warning metrics. We still need to find out more. Is it not just attendance? Is it not submitting your assignments? Is it not logging on? Because if we have distance learning, we got to identify kids early, and we don't yet have the research that really gives us a full understanding of what that could look like. We need to build capacity among districts to collect, analyze, and use this data. We have to promote interagency collaboration and review of data, especially when it's disaggregated and you don't know, not student identified. But we also can invest in making sure that folks who need it get confidentiality requirements so they can help intervene with particular kids. And most importantly, we're going to have to engage in, make sure that we're using the data and also absences in a positive, problem-solving way, not punitive action. And I mean those on two fronts. One is, don't want to punish schools. If a school owns up and says, I have a high level of chronic absence, this is a moment to give them support and problem solving. If a family is experiencing high challenges of attendance challenges, this is a chance to offer them support, not threaten them with court or legal action. And I think this is going to be especially important as we come into the next school year, when so many kids will have been out of any kind of in-person instruction, and that challenge of moving back into that mode of learning, get into the habit of being in school every day, and then being able to have all those connections to their peers is going to take a little while. And I also want to just urge you to think about how you can maintain information about who's not showing up in distance learning, if you have both distance and in-person, so that you can then help students and families to make good decisions about what kind of school option will work for them. So thanks so much for having me here, and I'm really excited to have Maureen, because Maureen is going to be able to tell you, last thing, sorry, for about one more slide. Just think about this as a matter of equity. Chronic absence is a leading indicator and a cause of educational inequity. It exacerbates equity gaps by causing kids to fall further behind. It's really an indicator of systemic challenges. And if we want to invest in recovery, we've got to use this data, which is one of the few forms of data we have on every single kid in schools, so that we can actually target our recovery efforts to really make sure everyone has a chance to thrive and succeed despite all the challenges of COVID-19. And with that, I now want to turn to Maureen, who will give you all sorts of tools for how you can actually tackle this approach.
Well, thank you so much, Hetty. And I always appreciate that, both the work that you do, but also from the very beginning, the focus on using quality data to support the discussion, to support the solutions that we have for our students. And so I really want to hone in on 3 of the recommendations that Attendance Works has put out. All of them are obviously really important. I think we have some tools to support with 3 of those, and those are around establishing the common definition for how you're collecting and what you're collecting when it comes to attendance, investing in data systems to track that information, and then building the capacity to collect, analyze, and use attendance data to support your students as we kind of rebound and return to learning after the pandemic. So as you sit in your districts and your states, in your offices across the country, you kind of have to create your own data story, right? And Hetty painted a very lovely data story for Connecticut, but individually as stakeholders across education, we also need to understand our data story as in what I need, what data do I need from what systems so I can do my job, whether that be from a principal leveraging information to understand what programs and resources to invest in, all the way to a parent, understanding my own students' attendance data so that I can help reinforce at home and make sure that my student gets to school and is engaged in their learning. We have some challenges sometimes in understanding this information and building that story, and it's not necessarily because we don't want to know the data, but because we have historically had a lack of interoperability in education, in K-12 education. And so we have data locked in silos, unstandardized, and a real challenge in supporting real-time analysis of information. Elise said at the very beginning that interoperability is the seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between applications. That has traditionally not been an easy thing to do. And that's not because we don't want to have data at our fingertips, but it's because we have developed systems to tackle certain things. We have developed assessment systems on one side of our agency and student information systems on another, and transportation systems, food services, all of these different systems that our districts use every day. They serve great purposes. They don't always talk to each other. And that's a challenge when we're trying to create a full picture of student learning. And so at the EdFi Alliance, what we strive to do is seed interoperability across K-12 education. And we do that by creating a data standard and offering in an open source manner the ability to have your data in one place in an operational data store, bring data in real time over APIs, and be able to use that data for purposes of reporting, visualization, dashboards, whatever it is you want to use that data for, but really being able to have that full picture of student learning. When the pandemic first hit and we all shut down, the community at EdFi, which is made up, it's an open source community made up of school districts, state education agencies, vendor partners from across the country, started coming together around this idea that we have big challenges that we haven't faced in education before, mostly around knowing where our kids are they showing up where they're meant to be, and are they engaging in their learning? And so we did a little bit of community research on how we can identify what new data and new data elements and new data practices need to be in place in order to support that information sharing. And so the 3 kind of big new elements of data that we have to think about and collect differently during the pandemic were really around that instructional modality, the method of attendance verification, and how we understand student engagement in that modality. We also noticed that a lot of need for collecting both the positive and negative attendance, not just who's not in the room today, but are people in the modality that they're meant to be in? Are our students showing up where they're meant to be? And so the paper that you just saw pop up in the corner of your screen gives some recommendations and some resources to supporting the collection of information around that new data. The other tool that I'm really excited to share coming out of the open source community for districts, especially that are looking at chronic absenteeism in different ways, or looking at how we support this going forward. We have a starter kit to support your work in standing up the EdFi ODS and a data standard to start pulling data from your disparate systems in order to start viewing your own individual data and how you can support students in terms of absenteeism. And so with this starter kit, you have some opportunities to engage in interoperability. The starter kit will come with a demonstration guide, which is kind of a show and tell of what you will find when implementing this, a quick start guide, which will give you the opportunity to download and quickly deploy on your own computer a set of test data so you can see what it looks like, and then a setup guide that will help you customize the solution and fit it into your own environment that you're working in now. And part of that absenteeism starter kit results in the quick stand up of some dashboards that will help you and your leadership start to dig into the data that you already have in your district. And so it comes with, you'll see this is Grand Bend ISD. That's our set of test data. It's a fake district, fake data. No real student data being showed on the screen right now. But you get a summary a view. You can break that down by subgroup and grade level. And then you can also set up, and the starter kit will walk you through this, role-based access to be able to have student level views for those who are eligible to and need the data on individual students. So the starter kit then will get you through to the point of being able to connect your own data to light up these dashboards. So it's pretty exciting as we're thinking about how to take some steps forward into next school year. I hope that's helpful. What I'm going to do now is turn things over to Noah to talk about what's actually happening on the ground in districts. So go ahead, Noah. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Maureen. And great to be with everybody today. My name is Noah Bookman. I'm the Chief Solutions Officer at Education Analytics. And what I'm going to talk about today is how we're operationalizing EdFi in order to support attendance analytics and on-track analytics across school systems. Just a little bit about our work in EA. So Education Analytics is a nonprofit based in Madison, Wisconsin. We work with a lot of districts and nonprofits and states across many states and partners across the country. Our work includes research, policy analysis, analytics, data interoperability, data dashboarding, and et cetera. We are a certified organization in providing an EdFi managed operational data store and managing EdFi based APIs and data systems. And actually, we recently were certified, and that's one of the great things about the EdFi Alliance is that they have certification processes for the various data sources like your student information systems, as well as assessment vendors, as well as folks like ourselves who help people actually operationalize and turn EdFi on. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give one example of how we're leveraging EdFi to interoperate data and to bring in data from multiple school systems on behalf of networks of school improvement. And so the Networks of School Improvement program is a program sponsored by the Gates Foundation. And the idea is that school teams in a network are working to improve student on-trackness. And one of the key indicators around on-trackness is certainly attendance and chronic absence. And it presents a bit of a challenge, which is certainly, once a year, it's not super hard, or it's hard, but not as not as hard as mid-year. But once a year to get data on how kids are attending school and do analysis. But when you're doing improvement work, you want more regular access to those data. And the question becomes, okay, how do you do that across different school districts with different attendance codes and different student information systems? Well, EdFi supports this piece. And it creates both sort of the infrastructure as well as the standard by which we can take data from these multiple school systems, work them through a process, and be able to provide regular updates around student attendance. And I'm going to do one kind of technical picture for in case there's like technical people in the audience that like these kinds of things, which is, the basic idea here is that we've got two different ways that we're bringing in data into a central operational data store, and then bringing that into a data warehouse for reporting. One is that in some cases, we're actually helping them stand up EdFi, and we're taking them through the mapping process and doing that. In other cases, districts already have an EdFi ODS, and we're sorry, this is a district EdFi ODS, this is EA hosted. And so the nice thing about this is, in one district, they host it themselves. In another district, we're doing it for them, but it's in a common infrastructure that enables us to then do this analysis across systems. And so the specific example, again, I'm going to talk about is in the context of continuous improvement. The Network for School Improvement program is about working with some supporting organization, which could be a county office or a nonprofit, or it could be a school district itself, who's working with a set of districts who are working with a set of schools and engaging in cycles of continuous improvement. So we've been able to take these data and, as I mentioned before, you show up in a district and you might find that there are markedly different approaches to attendance codes, even using the same student information system. And so we go through a process with each district to map those codes to what is a day of attendance, what is a day of absence, what is an unexcused absence or excused absence. And then we provide analytics like the ones you see here that we, in our case, we've adopted the framework provided by AttendanceWorks for how to think about different categories of attendance. And, we try to do some things like think about, periodicity. So we know that chronic absence kind of resets every 10 days. So if you look at it in the intervening days, it might go up and down, but really every 10 days it's consistent, because for every 10 days you can have one more day of absence without being chronically absent. And try to do things like, well, how does your chronic absence this year compare to this time last year? As well as helping schools think about the variation across different student groups and the variation across schools in terms of attendance rates. Who's got the strongest attendance? Who's got the attendance at greatest challenge? All of this then also helps us think about on-trackness in a broader way. So we've engaged in some predictive analytic work and iterated with our districts and school teams to identify 5 categories of on-trackness for youth. Everything from kids who are highly vulnerable to kids who are vulnerable or kind of in that in between. They're probably going to graduate high school, but maybe are at risk of not being graduating. In California, it's called graduating A to G, which is meeting the college prep requirements. Who are very likely to graduate and meet prep requirements, and kids who are in great shape. And one of the things I'll highlight is in our predictive analytic work, what we found is that attendance has a degree of predictive power. The most predictive thing for high school kids about how they're going to do in high school and beyond is their grades and their the rigor of the courses they're taking. In middle school grades, we also see that student test scores seem to play a predictive power, not as much in high school. But what I'll say about that is when we're looking at this group of kids, the kids who are highly vulnerable, that's where our predictive analytics suggest that, in our experience with you, suggest that you really got to start paying attention to attendance. For kids that are doing generally well in class, and taking harder classes, hey, if they're having some attendance issues, it's something to note, but the fact that they're doing well in class kind of supersedes that about these youth. But what our educators have found on the ground is having the attendance data next to these other pieces of information allows them to hone in on attendance issues with this specific group of students. One of the ways that we operationalize this is through a point system where we've taken our predictive models and turned it into something accessible. And so the idea is that you get a certain number of points based upon the difficulty of classes you take and how you do in those courses. But attendance has a weight here too, about 10 points out of the 100 in our on track measure. And that's based upon having done analysis of the predictive power, for example, in 8th grade. And we see something similar if we look at 9th graders or 10th graders. We then take, again, these data that we've been able to pull in across these multiple systems, and we're able to do analyses like what percentage of kids are vulnerable or highly vulnerable? What percentage of kids have moved up one on track level in a given year? And then, be able to do things like crosstabs to tell us, well, who came in looking like they're strong but is now in difficult shape, and how do we drill in on those students and then find out more about what's going on with them, including their attendance rates, and then look at that relative to these other pieces. So I might look at this student here and say, they came in highly vulnerable, but they've taken a good course load, and they're doing pretty well in that course load. They're doing okay. Their overall GPA is a 3.8, but their attendance is a little concerning, so some stuff to attend to here. We're then able to also do student profiles with this information to get a deeper student profile and think about it that way. And so what I think is what I want to point out about this is that many of you, maybe you're in a single district and you're able to do some analysis inside of your own district, but some of you might also be if you're in a single district, you might be thinking, okay, how do we link this data to other stuff like attendance, in which case Ed5 becomes a great infrastructure for that. Some of you might also be participating in like these cross-district or multi-district kind of collaborations, and it's not easy to think about, okay, how do we bring this information to one place and help all of our partners unpack these data, analyze them for improvement. And that's what we've been doing in our Network for School Improvement work and with other partners across the country. So some of the things that we're seeing in the field, though, as Hetty mentioned, it's we all know it's been wacky and that regular attendance taking is not there. And so some of what we actually saw on the ground is a little bit of some of our 9th grade teams that were working on Untrackedness not paying as much attention to the attendance data because of a little bit of a lack of trust. And so what we're hoping is that as we get in next school year, we start to get back into more of those regular rhythms around attendance. To build trust in an indicator as a really important early indicator, especially given the evidence that suggests a lot of kids have just not been engaged in school. And so we're seeing great emphasis in the field, our school teams that are working on this, looking at attendance as like a tertiary thing and really focusing on grades. And we also did some survey work this year to look at student relationships. Again, hopefully next year there's an opportunity to return to a focus on attendance as an early indicator early in the school year and throughout it. The other thing that we see as important in this piece is that we now have more information about kids. We have the work of standing up learning management systems and having more regular course data and trackable ways and tracking how kids are engaging in online experiences and turning assignments means we have more data to work with. And we see a real need to do some research around that to try to understand how do these multiple indicators of attendance and engagement help us better understand how kids are progressing and give us some clues that we can look at earlier and more often as to how our youth are doing. And so those are a couple of things that we think are important as we think about next year. And with that, I am going to turn it, I believe, back over to Elise, who is going to take us to the next piece.
And thank you, Hetty and Maureen, as well, for sharing all of this information and for such a great discussion. At this point, we'd like to open it up for audience Q&A. So for everyone attending, if you have any questions for the group, please feel free to type your questions into the chat. One question that I wanted to start us off with is, I know that COVID relief funding is something that is on a lot of school systems' minds. And we were wondering if you would be able to provide some of your thoughts around how school systems can use COVID relief funding to help with interoperability and with attendance tracking.
I think, one of the things that certainly comes to mind for me is that, the COVID relief funding, on the one hand is great, right? It's great to have more resources. But on the other hand, I know that one of the things that school systems are concerned about is how do we not make investments that are unsustainable. And so I actually think this is one of those moments where looking for kind of like those shovel-ready solutions and making investments in those solutions is really sharp. And so I'm just going to put on my my unfettered advocate hat that I think if you're at all thinking about EdFi as a solution set in your technology world, I think now's the time to do it. It may be that it takes you a hot minute to get it up and running, but I think it'll pay dividends long term. And the other thing is, as a community of education agencies, the more districts and states we can get using EdFi, the more we can put pressure on the vendors, whether they're student information system vendors, assessment vendors, learning management system vendors, to comply and get certified, which will reduce the cost of getting these data in our hands in more seamless ways, and increase our ability to do that across education systems. So I take that question as an opportunity to be an unfettered advocate for that to be a really good investment. So Maureen, I'll let you say if you've got other thoughts.
I was just going to say +1 to that. But also I think, when we think about, when I think about the funding coming in from the federal government right now for COVID relief, like this is one-time opportunity for incredible amounts of funding, right? More than we've seen in public education ever. If we get 3 to 5 years down the road and have to reinvest in the one-time point solution that we procured with this money, it's not going to be there anymore. And so utilizing a data standard, implementing interoperability, those are things that future-proof your investment of this one-time funding, and allow you to not get to that end of the funding cycle and realize that you need to upgrade your one-time solution, or whoops, it got sold to another bidder, and now you're out of sync with any services or support or whatever that may be. So think of interoperability and data standardization, hopefully through the EdFi data standard, as an opportunity to future-proof that investment. The other thing I'll say on this, there are a number of great resources out there, and I know Project Unicorn has done at least 1 or 2 webinars on how to use federal funding. So make sure to look at those pieces. So the Council of Chief State School Officers, the Data Quality Campaign, they've put a lot of effort into thinking about how do we parse out and understand the different funding streams and where they can be applied for data and technology work. So Elise is posting those resources now, so make sure to check those out. The last thing I'll say is that not only do we have this one-time money involved in COVID relief, but when the department provides money, they don't do it just they don't just throw it out there and hope that it does good things, right? They're also going to ask for data back. And so we know that they're going to be asking for data elements, rolled up to the department around operating school status, amount of instructional time lost, all of these different data elements that states and districts are going to have to start collecting if they aren't already, and have to provide to the department at some point, sooner rather than later. So all of this to say that the funding is there to support our students. Some of that funding is certainly able to help with data collection, with data systems. Let's make sure that we use it wisely so that we can continue to utilize those systems in the future past the funding cliff.
Elise, I would just add that the department has issued, in their second handbook on spending COVID relief dollars, explicit guidance saying that you can invest in building data systems that allow LEAs to make good decisions about what interventions they want to have in place, particularly related to chronic absence. So this is absolutely something that the feds have said. This is possible and advisable. And I would just say that I do think you want to think about both building the systems and the fact that we have a window where we have to, there are these large groups of students who missed out on a lot of instruction and will need extra intervention and support, not forever, but for a few years. But you want to figure out who that is, right? And you want to have the data systems to monitor whether the efforts you're putting in place, whether that's a proven tutoring strategy, success mentoring, these are both options for addressing learning loss and also addressing attendance, are in fact working. And the other thing I would say, it's not just the data systems, it's the professional development and capacity building, and you can invest in that as well, so that your educators on the ground, data sitting out in a data system not being used does not inform strategic decision making. You have to build the capacity of staff to interpret. So, and I don't know, Elise, I was noticing one of the questions, and I thought I might just tackle it in the about are districts defining full day attendance or half day attendance differently moving forward? And I'm wondering if I might start it and then also see whether either Maureen or Noah. So one thing I want to say is that before COVID-19, under EdFacts, they offered a common definition of attendance, was that you had to show up for at least half a day of school in order to be considered there. And when states supposedly report into EdFacts, which they're required to do every year, and they're reporting their chronic absence rates, in theory, they're reporting using a half-day metric. I will also say I'm not convinced that everyone has been. California, I'll pick, Noah and I live in California, so I'll pick on us. You know, we are funded based on average daily attendance in order for kids to show up. They just have to show up to one period, and it means our middle of high school reports, I believe, are probably undercounts of how many kids are actually chronically absent in middle and high school. What I think is important is actually to start collecting attendance daily for elementary and by period for high school students. And I think that could allow you to more thoughtfully understand who's missing too much school and also which classes. And that actually is extremely helpful. So there can be challenges with ensuring we can interpret the data across systems all the same way. But I think at the local level, using it for understanding who's at risk, doing it by daily and doing it by period in high school is pretty essential. And no, I don't know if you have any, you've worked a lot with districts, thoughts about how that might affect the predictive analytics.
I think it's a really good research question. I think it's only through something like EdVi where we'd actually be able to get the data on a period by period basis, because I think that in California previously we've been kind of limited in our analytics based upon sort of state longitudinal data system type approaches, which kind of use the like summarized up, if a kid attended any part of the day, it counts as a day of attendance. And so you really need to be going straight into the student information system for the more detailed information. So I think it presents an interesting research opportunity for us to dig into. One thing I wanted to plus up in what you brought up, Hetty, around the investment pieces, certainly on the, there's investing in infrastructure, which is great. There's different kinds of infrastructure too. So there's like literally data infrastructure, but you also might think about investing in your district's program analytics or program evaluation type infrastructure too, and also like program design. I think with any new spending opportunity or new investment opportunity, I know one thing, and I'm in California, although we work nationally, and so California's always on my mind. And my good friend and colleague Heather Huff, who runs the policy analysis for California education, has been talking a lot about like, hey, we've got this one-time resourcing. We've been trying to make the case that more money helps kids do better, and so we need to set ourselves up to demonstrate that's true. If we want to continue to make the case for education funding, and the only way you do that is through sort of being thoughtful both in program design and implementation and then measurement. And so that means thinking about, okay, so we're going to do a tutoring program, or we're going to do maybe something chronic absence related. We're going to do a home visit program. We're going to do a home phone call program where we're going to call certain kids and their families a certain number of times. whatever that intervention might be. I think our instinct is just to do it, which is great. But I think if we can take a beat and say, okay, what is the design of this intervention? Who is it for? How are we going to know that people participated in it? And how are we going to compare what happened with this set of kids to kids who didn't get the thing, or this set of kids compared to kids like these kids last year, which may require working with some external agency to help you think about that. But as organizations are thinking about their big bets, particularly the big bet interventions, how are you designing those to learn from them? How are you collecting information about who's participating, and then looking back at that information? So that's another kind of infrastructure, that sort of program design, program evaluation infrastructure that I would encourage you to think about.
Noah, I would also offer up that right now, because you're seeing such huge increases possibly in chronic absence, we got doubling, of chronic absence levels. And one of the things I'm worried about is people being overwhelmed. So many kids chronically absent. What do I do? Who do I serve? And one of the things I think folks need to do is establish priority groups and tailor the design, because you're talking about program design. So for example, if you have all these ninth graders that are going, you got both the incoming ninth graders and the ninth graders going into 10th grade. And then you want to think about what are interventions appropriate to that age group. And then if you think they're from these high poverty communities where the transportation systems to high school are not back in place, because that then adds more knowledge. Or these are kids who are dealing with multiple responsibilities. They're working and going into high school. So in fact, just going to in-person learning may not help them. You might want to have some hybrid models so that they can actually balance all the responsibilities. Or are we talking about kindergartners who've been maybe never had any kind of experience with formal learning at all? And then you have to actually think about a whole nother model, working with their parents, really establishing those partnerships. And so if folks can look at their data and say, who am I most worried about? Not individual kids. I mean, eventually you got to have individual connection, but what groups of kids? What do I know about their strengths, their assets, their challenges? And then how can I divine resources and interventions, and then evaluate where the kids who get those interventions do better?
Question just popped up in the chat, and I know we just have a few minutes left and need to leave a couple minutes to wrap up as well. But to follow up on that, there was a question around virtual academies popping up to provide options for families to continue online learning, potentially a place for students with unique family schedules that prevent them from a traditional 8 to 3 p.m. school day. Do you have any thoughts around that as a way to address chronic absenteeism, and how to determine if those types of models are effective?
Important question to ask. I worry a little bit about the virtual academies, that they don't provide enough personalized connection and support. I think looking at a mix, so they're not all virtual, but there's some really intensive work. And this is also why, as Noah and I both talked about, we need to have some better early warning metrics. How do we know in a kid in a virtual academy is falling behind and this is not working for them, and in fact they not need to go in person? So I think there both needs to be evaluation, but I think having really strong sense of what are the early warning metrics, if you're setting that up, is going to be absolutely essential. And maybe thinking more of hybrid models. When you look at the Connecticut data, the hybrid data looked not bad in terms of attendance. The fully virtual looked pretty awful. So I think we should take some lessons learned from what seemed to work this last year.
I think the only thing I'll add is, the one of the lessons I really appreciated in some of the work that folks are doing around like the improvement science kind of framework is that the information is in the variation, and so there are global things happening that you can say across these different structures, but the information is in the variation across schools, across grade levels, across students. And so there may very well be kids who are doing quite well in virtual academies, and there may be kids that are doing quite poorly. There may be virtual academies that are quite effective, and there may be many. It seems like on average, it's not as good. So I think there's a lot of information in the variation, and I think I would say, I would have to imagine that the intervention strategy for a student who is chronically absent, both the diagnosis of that and the intervention strategy is going to be different than an in-person kind of structure. And so, developing those intervention packages to be sort of dialed to those pieces, I think, is key.
Yeah, and Noah, I would just leave with kind of a plug again for interoperability and real-time data, because in order to identify those for individuals, we need that real-time connection of data across multiple systems.
Thank you all. Well, as we're right at time, I wanted to just wrap up by sharing everyone's contact info if you would like to reach out to any of our great presenters today. If you have any questions about interoperability or you're looking for more information, please feel free to check out our website at projectunicorn.org. Don't forget to sign the Project Unicorn Pledge. If you're a district and you think interoperability is important, you'll get this cool badge to display on your website, and you'll get access to the Project Unicorn community and technical assistance from the Project Unicorn team. And finally, thank you all so much. This was great, and we're so lucky to have these speakers. Thank you, Hedy, Maureen, and Noah for providing your expertise in this webinar. And thank you to those of you for engaging with your comments and questions. We'll be providing some follow-up with this session with links to a lot of the great resources that we provided. We'll also be sure to include our past procurement webinar information that was mentioned during the session. And we look forward to seeing you at a future event or webinar. Thank you so much.